My friends bet I'd leave early when they seated me next to a woman in her 50s. But I never wanted the night to end. On the night my friends deliberately seated me next to the oldest woman at the dinner table, I realized an ugly truth about the people around me. They hadn't come to celebrate anything. They had come to see who would end up the most uncomfortable. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm 37 years old, a software engineer for a design firm in Nashville. And I've been single long enough that my friends have started treating it like a medical condition requiring a group intervention. Jake, who organized the evening, called it a small dinner 10 people, an Italian restaurant on 5th Street, and an excuse disguised as just a chance for everyone to get together. I should have known better. Jake never arranged anything without a sideshow. By the time I walked in, the table was almost full. I spotted the only empty seat left at the far end of the table, next to a woman I'd never met before, and everyone was watching me. That was the first thing I noticed. Not her. The way everyone's eyes landed on me as I stepped inside, then drifted to the empty chair, then back to me again. The look people wear when they're waiting for an experiment to begin. She sat with perfect posture, one hand resting lightly against the edge of the table as she studied the menu. Her platinum hair was cut into a neat, elegant style. She wore a simple black dress. Fine lines framed the corners of her eyes, the kind that come from years of laughing, not worrying. The woman looked to be around 52, maybe 55, and she didn't seem remotely concerned about it. Jake stood up far too quickly. "Marcus, there you are." He waved like an airport ground marshal. "Sit down. That seat's yours." The woman lowered her menu and looked at me. Not nervously, not politely. She studied me with the calm expression of someone who had already figured out exactly what was happening before I ever walked through the door. "Marcus," Jake said, sounding just a little too cheerful. "This is Diana Merritt. She used to work with my dad. Used to work with his dad." I heard someone at the other end of the table stifle a laugh. Diana Merritt offered me a courteous smile. "Hello." "Hi," I said, taking my seat. Jake watched me expectantly. Everyone watched me expectantly. I picked up the menu. "Is the risotto here any good?" I asked Diana. She paused for a second. Clearly, that wasn't the question she'd expected. "I prefer the fettuccine," she said. "But the risotto is pretty good. It's not too heavy. Thanks." The table stayed quiet for another 2 seconds before everyone reluctantly drifted back into their own conversations, sounding just a little disappointed. I hadn't planned on talking much. Honestly, I intended to finish dinner, head home, and text Jake afterward to ask what on earth he thought he was doing. But Diana Merritt wasn't the kind of person who sat quietly. Not because she talked a lot. Quite the opposite. She hardly spoke at all. But every time she did, she landed right on the point. I asked what she did now because I couldn't think of a better place to start. She told me she'd taken early retirement from a major law firm after 28 years and was writing now. "Writing what?" I asked. "Mystery novels." She looked at me. "Don't look at me like that. I'm not looking at you any particular way. You have the expression of someone who just heard I keep salamanders as pets." I set my glass down. Pet salamanders sound perfectly reasonable. For a brief moment, she laughed. Not the polite little smile she'd given me before. A real laugh. Soft, quick. Then it disappeared again, as though she hadn't intended to let it escape. "What do you do?" she asked. I told her about my job. She asked specific questions, not the kind people ask just to be polite. She wanted to know about UX design, about the gap between the systems I built and what users actually needed, and why those two things so often failed to meet. "You know about UX?" I asked. "I spent 28 years reading contracts," she said. "Language designed to keep people from understanding things is my area of expertise." I looked at her for a second. That one hurt. That's exactly right. At the other end of the table, Ryan, Jake's friend, whom I disliked since 2019, was watching us with the expression of a man disappointed that nothing entertaining had happened yet. The turning point came when everyone started ordering wine. 2 glasses in, Ryan decided the table needed to lighten up. He called across the table. "Marcus, you doing okay over there? You and your dinner companion look like you're having a pretty serious conversation." He paused deliberately. "Miss Merritt, are you all right? He's not boring you to death, is he?" The table laughed. Not loudly, just enough for Ryan to know his performance had landed. Diana didn't look at Ryan. She looked at me. And for the first time that evening, I saw something she'd carefully kept hidden. Not exhaustion from tonight. An older kind of weariness. The kind that comes from sitting in far too many rooms exactly like this one. I set my glass down. Ryan, I said without turning around. She was just explaining why most enterprise software fails because of poor language design. I paused. You just proved another one of her points. The entire table fell silent. Ryan frowned. What the hell is that supposed to mean? It means you're talking without understanding what you're saying. Then I turned back to Diana. Where were we? She held my gaze for a moment longer than necessary. Then she picked up her water glass. We were at the part where users stop reading the instructions and start guessing. Right. I nodded. Go on. At the far end of the table, Jake stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Ryan turned to the person beside him, pretending nothing had happened. Diana didn't smile. She simply continued where she'd left off. Later, while everyone waited for dessert, Jake got up to use the restroom. As he passed behind me, he gave my shoulder a pat. I figured you'd come up with an excuse to leave early. I'm fine. Jake looked at Diana, then back at me, wearing the smile of someone watching his script fall apart. Seriously? We're having a conversation, I said simply. Jake walked away. Diana looked elsewhere, and for a second I thought she hadn't heard him. Then, a moment later, without looking at me, she said quietly, "You don't have to justify yourself to them." I know. Then don't. There was no accusation in her voice. Just honesty. The kind of honesty that comes from someone who's grown tired of watching people ask permission to treat her like everyone else. Okay, I said. For the first time that evening, she looked at me without evaluating me. Okay? She repeated. I won't do it again. She lowered her eyes to her plate for a second. Good. Outside the restaurant, everyone scattered into little groups. It was a cool November night in Nashville. Cold enough that people naturally stood a little closer together on the sidewalk, their breath drifting into the air in thin clouds. Jake had an arm around two friends. Ryan was calling for a rideshare. Diana stood a short distance away from the group, looking down at her phone while waiting for her car. I walked over and stood beside her. Not for any particular reason, simply because it was where I wanted to be. That mystery novel, I said. How far along are you? She looked up. Why do you ask? Because I want to know. A brief silence. Chapter 17, she said at last. They just found the second victim. I smiled. Did anyone see it coming? Everyone suspects the wrong person. Sounds promising. Her car pulled up. Diana picked up her purse, then paused. She looked at me differently this time. Not with the quiet observation she'd worn all evening. Something closer to someone who hadn't quite made up her mind. You're not what I expected when you walked in, she said. What did you expect? Someone who would spend the entire dinner staring at the menu so he wouldn't have to talk to me. I laughed. I did look at the menu. You asked about the risotto. That was a sincere question. She studied me for another second. I know. Then she opened the car door. Good night, Marcus. Deanna. She stopped. When you finish that novel, I smiled. Let me know. She climbed into the car and stared straight ahead. But before the door closed, I caught her smiling. Not politely. Not out of courtesy. It was the smile of someone who had just made a decision. Jake texted me at 11 that night. You okay? I honestly thought you'd hate me after tonight. I replied, I kind of do. Just not for the reason you think. He sent back a question mark emoji. I never answered. 3 weeks later, Diana sent me her phone number through Jake. She didn't text me herself, which told me something about how she moved through the world. I called. We spent 45 minutes talking about system design and everything wrong with modern mystery novels. By the time we hung up, I realized I didn't want the conversation to end. We met for coffee. Then she handed me a printed copy of Chapter 17. After I finished reading it, I sat in my car for another 15 minutes because I wasn't ready to go home. When I told her that, Diana looked at me over the rim of her coffee cup. Why? Because I wanted to know what happened next. In the novel? I looked back at her. Not exactly. She didn't blush. She didn't laugh awkwardly. She simply looked at me with the expression I'd come to recognize. Careful, measured, evaluating, and somewhere beneath it all, warmer than she ever allowed herself to appear in public. You know what people will think, she said. I know what Ryan will think, I replied. As for everyone else, I don't care enough to guess. I'm 16 years older than you. I know. That doesn't make things simple. Nothing worth having ever is. She lowered her eyes to her coffee. That's the answer of someone who hasn't paid the price for it yet. You're right, I said, but I'm willing to learn. 1 year later, I attended Diana's book launch at a small bookstore on Charlotte Avenue. Jake wasn't there. Neither was Ryan. Only Diana. And people who genuinely wanted to be there. She stood behind the microphone, reading the opening of chapter 17 with the same calm precision she brought to everything she did. I stood in the back, holding the copy she'd signed for me earlier that afternoon. Inside the front cover she'd written, "For the man who asked about the risotto," and stayed. Jake texted me around 9 that evening. "Heard you went to Miss Merritt's book launch. You're seriously doing this?" I looked across the room at Diana as she signed a copy of her book for an older reader, smiling the smile I now knew wasn't something she gave to everyone. I texted back, "I've never been more serious." He never replied. He didn't need to. 2 years after that dinner, I asked Diana why she hadn't simply walked out the moment Jake introduced her as though she were part of the evening's entertainment. She thought about it for a while. "Because the risotto really was pretty good," she said. "Deanna, and because you asked about the menu instead of looking away." I smiled at her. "That's it?" She met my eyes. "Sometimes all it takes is one person who's willing to look you in the eye." She paused. "That's enough to make you stay a little longer." What would you do if your friends seated you next to an older woman as the punchline to a joke, only for you to realize you'd never had a more interesting conversation in your life? And have you ever been underestimated before someone took the time to find out who you really were? Share your story in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.